I would like to thank on behalf of Dr. Lorenzo Cordova, the president of AINE, for your invitation, especially to Chief Saidi and to all the members of the Indian Electoral Commission. I want to start and make use of the time speaking. Of course, I'm going to speak about overseas voting in Mexico and our experience that we've had. In order to do that, I think it's useful to see what's the global context that we have. If we see this chart, we can see that over 3% of the world population are residing abroad. They're migrants that are residing outside their country. This comes up to around roughly 250 million people all over the world. And this has been dealt with in a number of ways. First of all, there we go. It's an honor to stand with my fellow colleague from Australia, which was the first country who had provisions for voting abroad. It was done that the start of last century. And as you can see, this was something that wasn't dealt with very much. So there were a few instances before that we could dig up. The Civil War in the United States, there was some provisions for military personnel to vote, but that, I mean, the first formal provisions were done by Australia. This wasn't dealt with very much with electoral bodies up until firstly after the Second World War, and then with the third wave, or the democratization of mainly Latin American and Eastern European countries. Today, more than 100 EMBs or 100 countries provide for provision for rules for voting abroad. Mexico, of course, came a bit late to our transition in democracy, which was late last century, and voting. The thing in Mexico, in order for you to understand what our reality is that around 10 to 15% of our population resides abroad, and they do so mainly in the United States. 98% of our migrants are residing in the United States. And they have very close ties to Mexico, many of them. For example, around $24 billion are returned to Mexico each year from persons who are working in the United States. And so there's a lot of relationship going on, familiar relationships, economic relationships, et cetera, et cetera. What we have here is, or what we had as a challenge in Mexico in order to recognize overseas voting or voting from the diaspora was, first of all, the certainty versus feasibility. Mexico has very complicated, intricate electoral rules due to the fact that we were not a democracy until very recently, and we had a one-party system, and everything that our transitions to democracy meant that we had to provide for independent institutions, autonomous institutions, because the people, or the opposition parties especially, didn't trust the government or all the governmental regime. Therefore, for example, as our good friend from Lesotho and Iraq, we could not conduct elections in our embassies because our ambassadors are part of the government and were not very trusted in order to count votes. That's a reality, and that's the reality that we have in Mexico. So we had to provide for something else. And what else was there? There was another problem in which we have a large number of population in certain areas. For example, if you take the consulate residing in Los Angeles, California, there are over 1.5 million Mexican nationals registered there. So if we wanted to have like Haiti or Dominican Republic, in which you can go to your consulate and fill out your ballot and vote, that would be a kind of a long line of Mexicans outside the consulate. So, and it would be a very visible line. Today, for example, in the morning, I was watching the US presidential debate, and Mexico came up very much more so than Russia or other superpowers, because we're neighbors, and the relationship between our countries it's complex. Therefore, in order to provide for the opportunity or recognize the political right to participation that we saw, Article 25 of the Charter, and we had to provide for some way of voting which was feasible, it was earned, and it was also discreet, and provided for securities for our citizens. This led to 5 main challenges on voter education or civic education. First of all, what we need to do is tell people residing abroad that they have a right. Mexico has had pretty much 3 great accomplishments in recognition of political rights. First was the right, or recognizing the right of women to vote, which was done in 1953. Then the right of young persons to vote, which was done in the 70s. And now, after 2005, we recognize the 3rd wave, which was tens of millions of people, the right to vote from abroad. Our migration is mainly economical, not so much political, and people usually don't choose to leave our country because they want to, or it's mainly because they don't have the possibilities to provide for their families in Mexico, and that says something about our migration. And what we want is for them to exercise their political rights in order to be able to choose a government that would listen to them and would provide with public policy that makes them the return home more possible. Second of all, what we have in Mexico is that we have a voting roll or an electoral roll that is also very sophisticated. And what we needed to do the first time, you could vote from overseas, but only if you had an electoral card that was, you had to apply for it in Mexico. So if you're undocumented and you're living abroad, it's kind of hard to ask for people to come here and then go back with the reality and the costs and the perils of doing that in order to get an electoral card. So fortunately, we were able to amend the law, and now people can enroll from abroad. We had to give information to our voters to register, because it's not like, for example, in Australia, as Lenny was saying, it's not something that if you voted, then you're still in the electoral roll. It's a one-off enrollment. So every time there's an election, you need to do things all over again. What are the voting methods? Which we had a postal vote, and now we've had in local elections some internet voting, which I'm sure that we can learn from other countries, because we've done that only in local elections. So I talked about that, and what we did was we got close to different Mexicans who have been or are famous or have been successful outside. For example, Los Tigres del Norte, which is a very popular group of Mexican music in the United States, soccer players, Formula One drivers, basketball players. and all celebrities that have helped us to let people know that they have a new right and they can exercise it. We provided with different ways of internet and a line that we could do. I had some adverts for you, but I don't think they're available. And this led for Mexico. If you see, we have Mexicans residing mainly all over the world. We had citizens registered from over 80 countries in the world, and from their point of origin was from the whole of the Mexican Republic. If you see, what we've done is send them, and when they register their ballot, which they would then put in an envelope and then put in a second envelope in order for it to, so when it gets to Mexico, the first envelope is open, so we have a secret envelope. And then the day of the elections, it is counted as well as the other votes. We sent also, because there were a small number, what we have is a dilemma, because now we have overseas voting and we recognize overseas voting, but there's a provision for candidates to go outside in Mexico and campaign, because that would throw our campaign finance regulations off the board. So now people can vote, but they don't necessarily have the information on who to vote for. So that's a challenge. And we've been doing, well, we sent them a few DVDs that the different presidential candidates recorded for them and told them why to vote for them. We can probably not do that in the future because it's very expensive, but fortunately internet has developed and evolved. We've had a very low participation, around 1% of the population, which is normal around the world, but in Mexico there's a high expectative for it to reach higher. Now with the possibility to apply for your voting card from abroad, we've already had more than 100,000 people who have applied in the last couple of months. So probably in the next presidential election, we will have more voters. Then what we've evolved, and the first presentation, I think it's very important, as our colleague from Iraq said, was if you can vote and if you recognize the right to vote, which is the best way to do it? Do you do it on the executive level, or do you do it on the legislative level? What is better for citizens? Some say that it's better to have the vote for the legislative because the congresspersons will probably pass laws that will benefit the diaspora, but others say, well, it's the executive and you should go. Probably both of them would be better, but we have in Mexico also the possibility to conduct now internet voting federally, and we're looking into that. And what I say is that if you trust the internet with your money and you can pay your bills and you can send money, why not your vote? But then again, this is politically very, very delicate. And I would close with one thing. I was remembering when in 2004 we went for example, to Washington, and the Undersecretary of State for the U.S. government told us that, well, they had no problem for us to conduct our voting abroad, and the U.S. government would support this because they believed in democracy and etc. And that was very important for us because politically it's kind of difficult, and our relationship. But also we had a very wide discussion with our Mexican-American foundations, including, yes, 1 minute, including Maldives and other countries, who they said, no, don't do that. We have to get the Mexican-American population to vote in the US elections. That's our goal, not for them to vote in the Mexican elections. And what we said, and I truly believe, is that when people are civically educated and they become citizens for every election and for every political process. So what we said was, let's work together, and if a person knows the power of their vote, if they know the power of the vote and they vote in the US elections, they will probably also become politically involved and vote in the Mexican elections. And if they're double nationals, there's no problem. They have a polity, they have two polities, and I think that only strengthens what we're here for, and definitely for Mexico, it's very important for 10% of its community to be recognized and to not be left behind. Thank you very much.